Hi and welcome to our new course from Cloud Certification Training, and this course is on deployment options in AWS. Now this course is intended for anyone looking for information on the different deployment services that are available in AWS. And I'm going to lay out common features available on these deployment services and try and articulate strategies for updating application stacks, and then at the end present a few examples of hybrid deployment models that you may use in complex workloads. There's going to be a few sections, and the first section is going to be the introduction, and obviously it's just a brief introduction to the different deployment options that are available. Now AWS caters to multiple customers with several unique requirements, so if you're an experienced user working on the AWS platform, you're probably aware of one of the philosophy of one size doesn't fit all. Whether you work in enterprise computing or hope to create the next big social media or gaming company, AWS provides multiple customization options to serve a broad range of use cases. So there's lots of different things available. And in section 2, talk about the AWS deployment services. Now, AWS offers multiple strategies provisioning infrastructure. You could use, as an example, you could use the building blocks Amazon EC2, you can use Amazon EBS, Amazon S3, and Amazon RDS, and leverage integration provided by third-party tools to deploy your application. However, if you want really great flexibility, you can consider the automation provided by the AWS deployment services, which we're going to go through in much greater detail. In section 3, we'll look at some of the common features. And AWS offers several key features that are unique to each deployment service. However, there are some characteristics that are common to these services, and each feature can influence service adoption in its own different way. So I'm going to take you through all of those different scenarios. And in section 4, we're going to talk about strategies for updating your stack. Now, depending on your choice of deployment service, the strategy for updating your application code could vary a fair amount. AWS deployment services bring agility and improve the speed of your application deployment cycle. But using a proper tool and the right strategy is really the key for building a robust environment. And in section 4, we're going to look at how the deployment service can help while performing application updates. In section 5, we're going to talk about the hybrid deployment model approach. Now, you can also use the deployment services in a hybrid fashion for managing your application fleet. For example, you could combine the simplicity of managing AWS infrastructure provided by Elastic Beanstalk and the automation of custom network segmentation provided by AWS CloudFormation. And leveraging a hybrid deployment model also simplifies your architecture, as it decouples your deployment method so that you can choose different strategies for updating your application stack. And then finally, in the last section, we're just going to run through and summarize everything that we went through and wrap it all up, and hopefully you will have learned a lot about the deployment options in AWS. Okay, now we're at the introduction screen, and we're just going to go through some of the AWS deployment options that are currently available. And firstly, we're going to have a look at a diagram. Don't get too alarmed at that. Straight up, we're just going to pick it apart and see if we can find the services that we will use for deployment. The first one to take note of, Elastic Beanstalk. Now, Elastic Beanstalk is the fastest and simplest way to get an application up and running on AWS. It's perfect for developers who want to deploy code and not worry too much about managing the underlying infrastructure. And we have AWS CloudFormation, which provides a sysadmin and the network architect and other IT personnel the ability to provision and manage stacks of AWS resources based on templates you create to model your infrastructure architecture. So as you can already see, depending on what your role is in your organization, you would use a different deployment tool. So at the moment, Elastic Beanstalk seems to be good for code and developers. whilst the CloudFormation is good for sysadmins, network architects, and other such people. And we have OpsWorks, which is an application management service that makes it easy for both developers and operations personnel to deploy and operate applications of all shapes and sizes. You could always use AWS Code Commit, which is a highly available, highly scalable managed source control service that hosts private Git repositories. So if you understand what that means, I would say you're a coder. And don't worry too much about these services at the moment. We're going to go through them in a lot more detail later on. Along the same lines, we have AWS Code Pipeline, which is a continuous delivery and release automation service for rapidly releasing new features to users, which is obviously used in combination with AWS Code Commit. And finally, on this screen is the Amazon EC2 container service, which is a highly scalable, high-performance container management service that makes it easy to run, stop, and manage Docker containers on a cluster of Amazon EC2 instances. Again, we're going to expand upon that in the upcoming slides. Okay, so let's move on and go into each one of these that I've just described in a lot more detail. So now we're going to go through each of the AWS deployment services that we covered in the last slide in a lot more detail this time. The first thing we're going to talk about, the first deployment tool we're going to talk about is AWS Elastic Beanstalk. Now, AWS Elastic Beanstalk is the fastest and simplest way to get an application up and running on AWS. It's perfect for developers who want to deploy code and not worry too much about managing the underlying infrastructure. So it's ideal if you have things like a 3-tier PHP, Java, Python, or even Ruby, Node.js, .NET, Go, and even Docker applications that can run on an app server with a database. So all that good development stuff. Elastic Beanstalk also uses auto-scaling and elastic load balancing to easily support things like highly variable amounts of traffic, and it works for you if you want to start small and scale up. That's what auto-scaling and elastic load balancing is good for. And some common use cases for Elastic Beanstalk will be things like web apps, content management systems, and API backends. So once again, Elastic Beanstalk is a good deployment tool for developers who want to deploy code and not worry too much about the underlying infrastructure. The next AWS deployment service that we're going to talk about is AWS CloudFormation. Now, who's this good for? Who can use this? It's good for sysadmins and network architects, according to this. So it provides the sysadmin, network architect, and other IT personnel the ability to provision and manage stacks of AWS resources based on templates that you create to model your infrastructure architecture. Now, these templates are pretty good and pretty comprehensive, and you can manage just about anything. Well, almost anything. So you can manage a single EC2 instance, or you could manage a multi-tier, complex multi-tier, multi-regional application with failover and auto-scaling and elastic load balancing and all those fun things. And once you do it the first time, you can use the template again, obviously. And using templates means you can impose version control on your infrastructure and easily replicate your infrastructure, like I just said, quickly and repeatedly. Now it's recommended also if you want a tool for granular control over the provisioning and management of your own infrastructure. And AWS Code Deploy is recommended as an adjunct to AWS CloudFormation for managing the application deployments and updates. As an adjunct, meaning alongside of. So you use AWS CloudFormation to write your templates, and AWS Code Deploy, which we will go into a little later, is used for managing the application deployments and the updates. Okay, now let's get into the fun part, and we'll go and have a look at CloudFormation on AWS.